Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. The Last Call. At the stroke of midnight, the phone rang. It was an old-fashioned landline, the kind with a heavy receiver and a loud, shrill ring that cut through the silence of the night. Emily, half asleep on her couch, stirred at the sound. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 12 a.m. Who could be calling at this hour? She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the receiver. The phone had been acting strange recently, buzzing with calls that went unanswered. No caller ID, just a strange, untraceable silence. But tonight, it felt different. There was an unsettling urgency in the ring, something almost unnatural. Her curiosity got the best of her. She picked up the receiver and pressed it to her ear. "Hello," she asked, her voice thick with sleep. The voice on the other end was faint at first, almost like it was coming from a great distance. Then it grew clearer, cold and emotionless, as if it were being spoken directly into her soul. "You have been chosen," the voice said, sending a shiver down Emily's spine. "At the stroke of midnight, you answered the call. Now you must face the consequences." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded like something much darker, something ancient. She tried to speak, to ask who it was, but the line went dead. Her breathing quickened as she stared at the receiver in her hand, her mind racing. What had just happened? Then the phone rang again. This time, Emily didn't pick it up. Her instincts screamed at her to ignore it, to run, but she couldn't move. Her eyes stayed glued to the phone, waiting for it to stop ringing. But it didn't. Finally, she gathered the courage to lift the receiver again. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaky. The voice returned, colder this time, full of an unsettling finality. "You will die tonight. You will not survive until morning." The words sent a wave of panic crashing over her. Emily pulled the receiver from her ear, looking at it as if it might bite her. She could feel the weight of the words pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Then, in the brief silence that followed, a loud crash came from somewhere inside the house. It echoed through the darkened rooms, and Emily's blood ran cold. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate, each one feeling heavier than the last. She reached the source of the noise, the kitchen. The back door was wide open, the wind howling through the empty frame. But no one was there. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she turned to leave. That's when she saw it. The phone was still ringing, its shrill sound filling the silence of the house. She couldn't bring herself to pick it up again, but the call was persistent, relentless. Her entire body felt paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. With a trembling hand, she finally grabbed the receiver. "Why me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice on the other end chuckled, low and menacing. "Because you answered." Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Emily's heart thudded in her chest as she fumbled to find a light switch. She could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway. Her pulse raced as she backed into the corner of the room, her breathing shallow. She wasn't alone. Then came the unmistakable sound of breathing, heavy, labored, coming from just outside the kitchen. The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood on end. She slowly turned toward the door, her eyes wide with terror. And that's when she saw it. Shadowed figures looming in the darkness. They were everywhere, creeping closer, their forms impossibly tall, their faces hidden in the blackness. Their presence was suffocating, and Emily couldn't breathe. The phone line crackled again, the voice now more urgent, more insistent. "You have mere hours left." The room seemed to close in on her, the figures moving closer, their shadows swallowing the light. Emily reached for the door handle, desperate to escape, but the door wouldn't open. With a final scream, she turned back toward the phone, knowing she was running out of time. But when she reached for it, something stopped her, something cold, clammy, and relentless, wrapping around her wrist. The line went dead again, and for a split second, the room fell silent. Then a voice, her own voice, whispered from the shadows, a reflection of the terror she felt. "It's too late." And in the darkness, something reached for her. Something ancient, something that had been waiting for her to answer the call. The grip on Emily's wrist tightened, cold fingers seeping through her skin, like ice crawling under her flesh. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the force was unrelenting. Her heart thudded in her chest as her body trembled from both the cold and the fear. The shadowy figures seemed to pulse in the darkness, their outlines shifting and flickering like a nightmare she couldn't escape. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air heavy, thick with an unnatural pressure. "Let go of me," Emily cried, her voice barely a whisper in the suffocating silence. But no words came in response. The shadows didn't speak, but they were closing in, their forms growing more defined with every breath she took. The grip on her wrist was now a chain of cold, unbreakable steel, dragging her toward the center of the room. She stumbled forward, the phone still hanging loosely in her other hand. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. It was as if the darkness itself was pulling her, drawing her into its depths. Then the phone rang again. The sound was deafening in the stillness of the room, louder than ever, mocking her. It wasn't just a call, it was a summons, a reminder of the doom that awaited her. With a surge of adrenaline, Emily tore her hand away, breaking the cold grip, just for a moment. She sprinted toward the door, her pulse hammering in her ears, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The room seemed to twist, the walls bending, the floor sinking beneath her feet. A low, guttural growl echoed through the darkness, an unsettling sound like the room itself was alive. It filled her ears, her mind, her soul. Something was coming for her, and it was getting closer. She turned, her eyes desperately searching for any escape, but the shadowy figures were no longer at the edges of the room. They were right behind her, closing in like a storm, their shapes contorting into monstrous, twisted forms. Their faces, if they had faces, were featureless, just hollow, empty voids. And then, in the center of it all, there was a figure, standing tall and silent. It was different, not a shadow, but something far more real, far more terrifying. It was cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing red, burning with an intense, fiery malice. The voice from the phone returned. This time, it was no longer distant. It was all around her. "You should have never answered," it whispered, the words dripping with venom. "Now your fate is sealed." Her throat went dry. Emily stumbled backward, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very air around her had turned to stone, immobilizing her. She raised the phone to her ear again, instinctively, even though she knew it would only lead to more torment. But this time, there was no voice. Instead, there was only static. a low, vibrating hum like the sound of something ancient awakening. The static grew louder, consuming everything else until it was the only thing left. And then, in the middle of the static, she heard it. A whisper, so faint she almost didn't catch it at first. "Don't answer again." Emily's heart stopped. She turned toward the figure, her eyes wide with terror. It grinned, its mouth stretched into a grotesque, impossibly wide smile. The darkness around her deepened, swallowing the room whole, and the shadows seemed to pull back as if to reveal something far worse lurking behind them. And then, with a sudden jolt, everything went still. The figure was gone. The shadows vanished. The room was empty again. The phone line crackled once more, and Emily, trembling, looked down at the phone in her hand. The screen flashed a single word: "Goodbye." Before she could react, the phone dropped from her hand, and she felt something cold, sharp, like claws, sink into her skin. Her body jerked, but it was too late. The darkness closed in around her, and in the final moments, Emily realized with horror that the call was not just a curse. It was the beginning of something far worse. The door to the room opened behind her, but it wasn't a way out. It was another step toward her fate. And the last thing she heard, as she was pulled into the void, was the voice, now clear and final, whispering, "Everyone answers, eventually." Story 2. The Watcher in the Woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. A group of 5 friends, Emma, Josh, Sarah, Mark, and Lily, decided to leave the chaos of city life behind and spend a few days camping in the dense woods just outside town. The air was fresh, the sky a deep blue, and the trees whispered in the wind, casting shadows that felt both calming and mysterious. They set up their tents, built a fire, and shared stories under the stars, completely unaware of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of their campsite. As the night grew darker, the forest seemed to come alive. Strange sounds echoed from the trees, rustling leaves, cracking branches, and distant, eerie howls. But they shrugged it off as the typical noises of the woods. After all, they were used to camping. They laughed, drank, and enjoyed the fire. However, as the hours passed, an unsettling feeling began to creep into their minds. It started with the way the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, bending in ways that defied logic. Then, they started hearing footsteps, slow, deliberate, and faint, almost like someone or something was walking just out of sight. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice tight with unease. The others fell silent, straining their ears. The forest was suddenly too quiet. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of animals, just the sound of their own breaths and the crackling of the fire. "It's probably an animal," Josh said, trying to sound confident. "A deer or something." But even as he spoke, the footsteps came closer, growing louder. And then, just as quickly, they stopped. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe we should go to bed," Mark suggested, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. They all reluctantly agreed, one by one retreating into their tents. But as Emma zipped herself into her sleeping bag, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. A cold chill crept over her, making her shiver despite the warmth of the fire. She lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the shadows that seemed to flicker and dance across the walls of her tent. The night passed, but it wasn't peaceful. Every rustle of the wind made Emma jump. Every crack of a branch made her heart race. The others were asleep, but she couldn't find the peace to follow them into slumber. And then, in the dead of night, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound at the edge of her tent. It was too quiet to be a wild animal. too deliberate. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She slowly pulled back the zipper of her tent, just a crack, enough to peer out into the dark woods. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, but saw nothing. Nothing but darkness. The scratching continued, closer this time. Then a voice, a whisper, barely audible, floated on the breeze. Leave or die. Emma froze, her blood running cold. She could barely move, her body paralyzed by fear. The voice was coming from the woods. It was close, so close. In a panicked rush, she quickly zipped her tent shut again, the scratching now relentless, as if something or someone was trying to get inside. She lay there, trembling, wondering if she had imagined it. But the fear clawed at her, refusing to let go. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the side of her tent. It was enough to make her scream. She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and bolted for the door. She yanked the zipper open, desperate to escape, but the campsite was empty. Her friends' tents were all undisturbed, as if no one had moved. No one had heard the strange noise. "Guys?" Emma's voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. She rushed over to each tent, shaking them, but there was no answer. The only sound now was the wind rustling the trees and the ominous silence that filled the air. It felt wrong, so wrong. Then a rustling came from the woods, faint but growing louder. Emma's heart raced as she turned toward the trees, knowing something was out there. Something watching them. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The air grew thick with dread, and then she saw it, out of the corner of her eye. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes glowed, two dull yellow orbs that pierced through the darkness. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Guys!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the night. The figure didn't move, but Emma could feel it staring at her, its presence a weight pressing against her chest. The rest of the campsite was eerily quiet. The shadows seemed to stretch, warping and twisting unnaturally, as if the forest itself were closing in around her. She ran to the nearest tent, calling out for her friends again. Mark, Josh, Lily, and then she heard something else. A low guttural growl. The figure in the woods took a step forward, and Emma's blood ran cold. Without thinking, she ran, sprinting through the dark forest, branches whipping at her face. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The growl echoed again, closer this time. Something was chasing her. Something fast. She could hear it crashing through the underbrush behind her, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding the earth. She turned her head just for a second, and there it was, the glowing eyes getting closer. She screamed as something grabbed her ankle, yanking her to the ground. She twisted in the dirt, kicking and scrambling, but it was too strong. She felt its cold grip tightening around her leg. And then she heard it, the voice again. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was loud, unmistakable, and filled with malice. "You should never have come here." The world spun around her as the figure dragged her into the darkness. The screen cuts to black. Text appears. Is Emma the next victim of the Watcher? Or has something far more sinister been waiting for them all along? Story 3. The Silent Room. When Adam first moved into the old apartment, it seemed like a perfect fit. It was affordable, quiet, and nestled on a secluded street where few ever passed by. The building itself was aged, the paint peeling on the exterior, the creaking floors a reminder of its age. But what truly intrigued Adam was the one peculiar thing about the apartment. There was a room in the back, a small, narrow door at the end of a dark hallway. It was locked with no key in sight, and the landlord had been very clear about one rule: do not enter the room. At first, Adam thought little of it. He had other things to focus on: unpacking, settling in, and adjusting to his new life. But as the days went by, the locked room began to gnaw at him. There was something about it, something off that he couldn't shake. The landlord's warning, the secrecy, the way the hallway seemed to grow colder every time he passed by, it all added to the air of mystery. Curiosity grew into obsession. He'd lie awake at night, hearing strange creaks and groans coming from behind that door. Sometimes the sound of faint whispers seemed to seep through the cracks, though there was no one in the apartment except him. He began to wonder what was behind that door. Why was it locked? Why was no one allowed to enter? Finally, the temptation became too strong to resist. Adam went to the local hardware store, bought a small toolkit, and returned to the apartment. That night, when the silence was thick and the moonlight cast long shadows across the walls, he stood before the door, key in hand, his heart racing in anticipation. With a deep breath, he inserted the key into the lock. It turned with an odd, almost unnatural smoothness, and the door creaked open. The air that poured out was cold, heavy, like the room had been sealed off for years. Adam stepped inside. The room was small and sparse. The walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper that had long lost its color. The floor was covered with dust, untouched for as long as the door had been locked. But what struck Adam the most was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence he had expected. It was deeper, more oppressive, as if the room itself was holding its breath. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chair, positioned as though someone had been sitting there, waiting. There was nothing else, no pictures, no furniture, just the chair, the dust, and the heavy silence that seemed to press in on him. Adam's curiosity drove him forward. He approached the chair slowly, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. As he drew closer, he noticed something strange, a faint outline on the floor, as though something had been dragged across it over and over. The marks led to the chair, and he couldn't help but follow them. His heart began to race as he sat in the chair, feeling an odd, uncomfortable sensation wash over him. It was as if the chair didn't belong in the room, or perhaps it was the room that didn't belong in the apartment. But before he could ponder it further, the air around him seemed to grow heavier. The silence became suffocating, and he could feel his chest tighten. Then, without warning, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, like the wind rustling through a distant tree. But then, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, above him, below him, beside him. And they weren't just whispers. They were pleas. "Leave this place," one voice begged, weak and trembling. "Go while you can." Another voice, darker and more menacing, hissed, "You should not have come. You're not supposed to be here." Adam stood abruptly, panic setting in. He turned toward the door, but it was gone. There was no longer a door, just a solid wall of blackness where the entrance had been. The room had changed, shifted, and he was trapped. He turned back to the chair, his mind racing. The whispers had become a cacophony, a chorus of voices that seemed to converge on him. Some begged him to leave, while others mocked him, taunting him for his curiosity. And through it all, one voice, louder than the rest, spoke with chilling clarity. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and Adam could see his breath misting in front of him. His pulse raced as the room began to warp around him. The walls stretched outward, the ceiling lowering, and the floor seemed to tilt as if the entire space was collapsing inward. In that moment, Adam realized something terrible. This room, this place, wasn't just part of the apartment. It was part of something older, something that had existed long before the apartment building had been built. The room was alive, alive with the echoes of those who had come before him, those who had dared to open the door. And now it was his turn. The chair behind him creaked as if someone, was sitting in it. Adam spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. A shadowy figure had materialized in the chair, a twisted silhouette of a person, its face obscured by darkness. The figure leaned forward, and in its raspy, hollow voice it whispered, "Now you belong to the room." Adam's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, the weight of the room pressing down on him. His vision blurred, and he could feel the air thickening around him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the face of the figure, a hollow, empty face, with eyes that seemed to devour all light. And then there was nothing. The room, silent once more, waited for the next curious soul to arrive, its door locked tight, the whispers of its past inhabitants fading into the walls. The apartment was as quiet as it had ever been. Story 4. The Puppet Master. Simon had always been a solitary man. His life was uneventful, spent behind the walls of his small apartment with only the company of books and the occasional television show to fill the void. He had no family to speak of, no friends, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he found comfort in his solitude. But something was missing, a spark, a connection, something to bring excitement back into his dull existence. One chilly evening, while wandering through the city, Simon stumbled upon a strange little shop tucked away on an obscure street. It wasn't the kind of place he would normally enter. Its windows were dusty, its sign old and worn. But something about it beckoned him, as if it had been waiting for him all this time. He pushed open the door, and the bell above the entrance let out a soft, eerie chime. He pushed open the door, and the bell above the entrance let out a soft, eerie chime. The air inside smelled of aged wood and dust, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across shelves cluttered with bizarre objects, antique clocks, tarnished mirrors, and strange trinkets. But it was the puppets that caught his eye. There, on a shelf in the far corner, was a single ornate puppet. It was beautifully crafted, dressed in a tattered suit with hollow eyes that seemed to follow him wherever he moved. Its wooden joints creaked as if alive, and its expression, something between sadness and malevolence, sent a shiver down his spine. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with a crooked back, appeared from behind a stack of old crates. "Ah, I see you found my special one," he rasped, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "It's not for sale to just anyone, but I can make an exception. This one, it has a unique connection to its owner." Simon, intrigued and desperate for something to fill the emptiness inside him, nodded without hesitation. "How much?" The old man gave a crooked smile, revealing yellowed teeth. "Not much, but be careful. It's not just a puppet. It's more than that." Despite the warning, Simon handed over the money and left with the puppet, clutching it tightly as if it were an old friend. As he left the shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the puppet were still watching him. At first, Simon didn't notice anything strange. He placed the puppet on a shelf in his living room and went about his usual routine. But over the next few days, he began to feel different. His movements seemed sluggish, as if he wasn't fully in control of his own body. His thoughts, too, felt like they were slipping away from him, as if something or someone was guiding them. One evening, Simon sat in his armchair, staring blankly at the television. He reached for his glass of water, but as his hand moved, it wasn't him controlling it. His fingers stiffened, and before he could stop it, the glass tipped over, spilling water onto the floor. He blinked in confusion. He hadn't meant to do that. But the worst was yet to come. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt something stir in the room. He was wide awake, but his body refused to move. It was as if an invisible force was holding him down, keeping him still. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then he saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, just like the puppet. Simon's breath hitched in his throat as the figure began to move. Slowly, with jerky, unnatural movements, it stepped toward him. It was the puppet. Somehow it had come to life. Simon. The puppet's wooden mouth opened, and its voice was a low, rasping whisper. "You belong to me now." Suddenly, Simon's limbs jerked violently, as if he were a puppet being controlled by strings. He tried to fight it, tried to regain control of his own body, but it was no use. His arms and legs moved against his will, each movement sharp and painful, like being pulled by invisible threads. "No!" Simon screamed, but the puppet's voice echoed in his mind. "You are mine now. Every move you make, every thought you have, I control it." Simon's world blurred as he fought to free himself, but the more he struggled, the tighter the strings seemed to pull. It was as if the puppet had attached itself to his soul, controlling every aspect of his life. He tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but his throat wouldn't form the words. The next morning, Simon awoke on the floor, disoriented and trembling. He looked around in a panic. Everything seemed normal, but his body felt wrong. He checked the time. It was already afternoon. Had he slept through the entire day? As he got up, he felt a strange compulsion to look at the puppet. It was sitting on its shelf, just as it had been the night before. Its hollow eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he swore he saw a flicker of something dark and malevolent behind them. He tried to leave the apartment, but as he reached the door, his body froze. He couldn't move. His hand, as if controlled by the puppet, reached for the doorknob and turned it. He stepped outside, and as his feet hit the pavement, he felt a pull, a tugging force, as if the puppet were guiding his every step. No, Simon thought desperately, but his body didn't listen. He walked down the street, not by choice, but because the puppet wanted him to. As Simon stumbled through the streets, his mind raced. What had he done? Why had he bought that cursed puppet? He tried again to regain control, to snap out of it, but it was as if he were trapped in someone else's body, someone else's life. He realized, with growing horror, that the puppet was not just controlling his body, but his entire existence. The world around him began to distort. Buildings warped, trees bent unnaturally, and people on the street froze in place, their faces blank and lifeless. Everything was under the puppet's control. In a moment of clarity, Simon understood the terrifying truth. The puppet didn't just control his movements. It controlled his life. Every choice he made, every decision was no longer his to make. He was nothing but a marionette, dancing on strings that he couldn't see. As the sky darkened and the puppet's eyes gleamed brighter, Simon felt a cold dread wash over him. He had no idea what the puppet wanted from him or how far its control stretched. But one thing was certain, he was never going to be free. And then the puppet's voice echoed in his mind, a sinister promise. You are mine forever, Simon. There is no escape. The screen cuts to black. Text appears. Will Simon break free from the puppet's grasp, or has he become its eternal slave?
If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting just for you.